So first of all, what is remote Git repository and how does it look like? There are a couple of different Git repositories out there. There is GitHub, GitLab. They're both cloud repositories. They're hosted by the GitHub and GitLab, and you can create your own repositories and keep your code in there. So these are platforms that everybody can register on and host their repositories. Mostly, however, companies do not host their code on some public cloud provider of Git repository, but they have their own Git repositories hosted in the company on company servers, right? So alternatives for that is Bitbucket. You can also host GitLab locally on your own servers in the company and keep your code there. As a private developer, you can also host them on GitHub or GitLab along with other repositories there. One thing to note there is that when using GitHub or GitLab, for example, as your code repository, you can decide whether to make it private or public. Usually when you're developing a software application, if you're a startup, for example, you don't want your code to be available and accessible to wide public, right? So you would want only you to have access to it and maybe your team members. So there are private repositories on those platforms and public repositories, right? Public repositories are used for public libraries, for example, for different programming languages or some open source projects. As I mentioned, these repositories have UIs, so user interface, and you can do a lot of stuff with the repository. You can create, update, change files, etc. You can give permissions, you can add users who will have access to the repository, and so on. You can do pretty much everything with it. So this is how these repositories look like. I have GitLab and GitHub. One thing to note here is that these organizations did not create the Git itself, right? These are just repositories, and the naming may sound like Git kind of belongs to them, but it's actually a separate project. So these are just repositories that emerged with a pretty powerful and pretty good user interface. So the first thing you need in order to use these publicly hosted GitLab and GitHub repositories is user accounts, right? So no matter which one you choose, you can go just with one of them. You have to create an account. I'm just going to sign in because I have an account. And first of all, let's see on GitLab. I already have a couple of repositories, and here you see some of them are public. These are things that I want others to have access to, the whole public. And there are some that are my own projects and I'm working on them myself. So they are made private. Only I can access those projects. And creating a new repository is as easy as just clicking on Create New Project. I'm going to name it My Project. And in the project URL, we need to select a group or namespace. You probably don't have any groups, so don't worry about that. You will see users with your account username. So that will be the namespace for this project. So you can select that. I'm going to select one of my groups, but it doesn't actually matter for this case. And here I choose the private repository. And for this test project, we will not create a README file during creation. And the repository is ready. And here you see the whole section where you can interact with the project, right? I can create new files, I can add a README file, I can set up continuous integration, and I can do all sorts of things. I can push my code to this remote repository and so on. In the same way, it's pretty similar. I can create a new repository just like that. Private, public, repository name, and create repository. So very simple concept. Those two UIs are also pretty similar. So it doesn't really matter which one you choose for your own project. In this case, we can actually go with GitLab because I have most of my projects here. So I have my project repository created, and now we have a remote repository. Now, how do we get this repository locally? So if I want to work in this, how do I access this remote repository from my machine? The first thing is that you have to install Git client. It could be a UI tool, Git client. There are multiple out there. I personally use Git command line because it's very straightforward. You have a handful of commands that you have to memorize, and that's it. And you can work pretty easily with that. So depending on which operating system you're using, you can install Git command line on your machine. Before we begin to work with Git via the command line, we can actually customize the terminal so that it displays useful information such as what branch we are working on. To do this, we need to modify the shell configuration file already here on my machine using vim. If the file does not exist yet on your computer, you will need to create one using the touch command. You just need to copy and paste the configuration found in the video description, save your changes to the file, and reload the terminal to have the same configuration as me. So once you have customized the terminal and have the Git client installed, we can actually clone the repository. So the first time when you do not have a local copy of that remote repository, you have to clone the repository. And also very helpful, whenever you create a repository, either in GitLab or GitHub, you actually get the whole instruction list of how to clone the repository, how to fetch it locally and make it accessible, how to download and start working with it. So the first command is git clone repository name. And this is actually the repository name. This is GitLab endpoint. This is my username. And this is the repository name. However, before I can clone the repository, any repository on GitLab or GitHub, I have to connect my Git client with GitLab or GitHub. And with connecting, I mean I have to tell GitLab, hey, I have an account on GitLab. This is me as a user, and I'm trying to connect from my machine using a Git client. So I have to authenticate basically to GitLab from the command line. And the way to do that is by adding my SSH public key to GitLab. And again, everything I configure here is exactly the same on GitHub. So I'm just going to use GitLab as an example, but know that everything works the same on GitHub. In order to do that, I have to go to my user settings, which I can find under my GitLab profile. And in settings, I have SSH keys. And I have to add my public SSH key here so that Git can identify my client, so to say, where I'm sending the request to, and then I'll have to authenticate. And also a very clear guide to an instruction to how to add that key to GitLab. So we're going to do that next. So first, if you already have that key, you can check that actually in your home directory.ssh. You can basically just copy it here and create the key. Or if you don't have it, they also have a instruction guide to how to generate that key. And then you would copy that and add as a key, right? So very descriptive, very easy to follow. So first, let's do that. So this is going to be my public key, and I can basically print it out and copy the output as a key. So I can copy that output right here and just add the key. And I already have added my key here. So now I can access GitLab using my Git client. So let's close that and actually clone the repository. So I'm gonna do git clone repository, and it worked. It's just a warning that I have an empty repository. There is nothing there. So if I do ls, I see that this folder got created, which has the name of the project. And if I go inside, so now this means that I am in a local copy of that remote Git repository. And let's actually see what's in there. It's completely empty. There is one thing that is inside the repository, and that is .git folder. And .git basically has information about the repository itself, right? It has information about the branches, it has the history, the log, as I mentioned, and it has the configuration, endpoint, obviously, the remote endpoint where this repository lives, and so on. And this kind of stuff like who is the user and what is the user email that is interacting with the Git repository and so on. You can also execute these 2 config commands to configure username and email globally for all your Git projects. So every user that clones the repository locally will have this .git folder, and they can actually configure whatever they want in this Git folder, right? This is just for local use, you can say. So now, because we have added our SSH key, GitHub will be able to authenticate us whenever we pull or push from the repository or we interact in some way without having to provide username and password all the time.